first session. We begin with a paper, well, with a session devoted to romantic criticism, literary criticism. The title of the first panel is Romanticism and Literary Criticism. Our first speaker will be Professor Frances Ferguson. Professor Frances Ferguson comes from the University of Chicago, where, well, she has taught at the University of California, Berkeley, and Johns Hopkins universities before joining the English department at Chicago, where she's an N and L Lawrence Budweiser Distinguished Professor. She's also chair of the English department. She has written Wordsworth. Among her books, she's written quite extensively, but among her books are Wordsworth's Language as Counter-Spirit, Solitude and the Sublime, Romanticism and the Aesthetics of Individuation, and Pornography, the Theory, What Utilitarianism Did to Action, in addition to essays on 18th century literature, Romanticism, and literary theory. She is recently at work on a study of the rise of the mass education around 1800 and on a brief history of reading and a practical criticism. Frances Ferguson has recently been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So please join me in welcoming Professor Frances Ferguson. And her paper today will be entitled Romantic Originality and Romantic Criticism.
Dropping things as I go. Thank you very much, Lena, for that introduction and for inviting me. Thank you, Michael Forster, for including me, and thanks to all of you for being here this morning. I realize that my title is not in perfect alignment with my paper, so I hope that you'll think during the time you're hearing this paper of what a better title would be. I'm open to suggestions. Over the past 30 years, the scholarly discipline known as philology has been repeatedly redescribed and reassessed in essays of various lengths and scholarly monographs of substantial erudition. James Turner's Philology, The Forgotten Origins of the Modern Humanities, published in 2014 by Princeton University Press, is only the most recent that I know of. Sometimes literary scholars recount the story of the rise of philology as one in which the emergence of philology is only one aspect of the story of the rise of literature, a complement to the study of literature as a subject of discussion for the intelligent common reader. Philology is, in this account, the more scholarly face of an interest in literary texts, a way of discovering the layers of development of a text and the various historical circumstances that made it possible. Sometimes other literary scholars follow a different track, such as Paul Demand's more localized institutional history, a particular course that Reuben Brower gave at Harvard, in which Demand and a number of talented persons of his generation taught when they were in graduate school. That approach emphasizes the reading of texts rather than a history of the production of texts. And I hope that by the end of the paper you'll see the ways in which these two things converge in their ways of disputing one another. On the former account, philology aims to introduce historical constraints on the reception of texts. On the latter, it is concerned to limit the claims that historicizing philology would make, and to argue that it may not be possible to point to the meanings of a text by amassing documentary evidence external to it. Now, philology is by no means an exclusively romantic phenomenon, as the work I've mentioned may demonstrate. And I should concede that before proceeding to develop an argument about its importance to the study of Romanticism. An especially useful portion of Turner's book on philology attends to classical, medieval, and Renaissance versions of philological inquiry, even before the discipline was christened. And the spate of recent studies is concerned to lament what commentators see as the current fallen state of philology, one in which it has earned an undeserved reputation for irrelevance that goes along with its long-standing association with pedantry. If Nietzsche's characterization of philology as slow reading has provided a justification for close reading of texts without particular concern for historical context, Sheldon Pollock provides an equally capacious definition in describing philology as the discipline of making sense of texts, while insisting that de Man's description of close reading is nonsense. For Jerome McGann, philology involves taking the library as one's laboratory and discovering fresh sense in previously known texts by situating them in relation to those newly uncovered materials. And for James Turner, philology revolves around the increasing rise of an interest in framing knowledge in relation to documents and documentary evidence. Having acknowledged that philological practice has a long history avant and après la lettre, I want nevertheless to talk about its importance for Romanticism. The question of philology has marked prominence for Romantic studies for a number of reasons. First, it was christened in the Romantic era. Nietzsche, in good philological fashion, identifies the 8th of April, 1777, as the birthday of philology, it being the day on which Friedrich August Wolff named a discipline that did not at that moment have a title. Second, the discipline of philology enables us to see an aspect of the topic of originality that is hard to come by in the analysis that M.H. Abrams gave us decades ago when he chose the mirror and the lamp as the identifying symbols for the 18th century and the Romantic period, respectively. Abrams treated Romanticism as a period in which the depiction of subjective experience, the lamp, came to prevail over the project of representing nature and one's classical predecessors, the mirror. And he did so largely by citing poetry and critical essays that made statements about the nature of literature. Originality appears in Abrams' account on the side of novelty and the sense that authors should not be shackled to classical tradition. And originality, as the search for a new set of originals, does not figure prominently in his discussion. What I'd like to focus on here today is not an answer to questions about whether the Romantics were more original than the classicizing writers that the British tradition has named the Augustans, or whether the notion of originality is a useful one in general. Instead, I'd like to look at the impact that philological criticism has had on conceptions of texts and documents, on how criticism affected our notions of how to deal with textual documents, whether fictitious or historical. The philological concern with identifying the original of a text and the stages of its development over historical time suggests how much pressure was being put on the idea that subjective experience should not merely seize upon objects, but should demand adequacy of those objects. That interest in finding justification for one's thoughts in something outside oneself is rather different from the notion of originality as Abrams defines it. For him, it's primarily a creative thing. When philology as a discipline continually seeks reliable and authentic accounts of the materials on which we can rely, it gives us a way of understanding originality that might be different from the self-generating inspiration that scholars like W.K. Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley long ago pilloried. Philological pressure continually insists that subjectivity is no longer internal to individuals who may or may not describe it. In demanding that text individuals engage stand up to historical scrutiny, it recasts the debate between the ancients and the moderns. Romantic philological scholars didn't so much reject the value that their predecessors set on classical and biblical texts. Rather, they claimed to be more committed to those originals than their predecessors had been. The moderns of the Romantic era aim to recapture the originality of the ancients more distinctly than writers of the 18th century had done. From the moment of its naming, philology was a contentious field, and for good reason, the more trivial being that philologists themselves from the first entertained very different notions of what the discipline entailed. For Western Europe, philology threatened not so much to destroy individuals' beliefs as to discredit the evidence that people customarily appeal to in support of those beliefs. In the Prolegomena ad Homerum of 1795, Wolff outlined his theory that Homer was a composite figure, a construct pieced together from writing of various different eras, composition of various eras that had been then written down. Scholars such as Eichhorn applied the historicizing techniques of classical philology to the Bible to produce analyses of the different strata of the Pentateuch. the lower criticism of Spinoza, a philology from within texts, if you will, relied on an internal contradiction in the biblical text to discredit Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Moses, he argued, could not have reported his own death. Whether applied to classics and a classical religion that philologists were not tempted to believe in, or to religious texts themselves, philological procedures and claims had the effect of unseating previous understandings of what a text was and what authority one might derive from quoting it. At one point in his essay, Future Philology, Pollock includes Spinoza, that classic practitioner of the lower or internalist criticism, as a philologist so as to recruit Spinoza's arguments on behalf of freedom of expression for philology itself. And though Spinoza's arguments in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus in favor of freedom scarcely rely on anything approaching philological method as the higher critics practiced it, there's something to Pollock's claim. Spinoza, paraphrasing the biblical text in 6970, takes it to mean no more and no less than that there is a God, one and omnipotent, who alone is to be adored and cares for all men, loving most those who worship him and love their neighbor as themselves. And that's a quotation, obviously. Now, what's remarkable about Spinoza's practice there is that essentially he's taken the entire Hebrew Bible and has summed it up in something like a scant 24 words, so that the paraphrase in essence takes the place of the text itself. Insofar as people seek to use the influence of religion to compel other people to agree with them, any philological enterprise that unseats the texts that are the instrument of such influence can be seen to strike a blow for freedom. Spinoza's argument against the sinister influence of the priests thus comes to be a central tenet of the work of Joseph Priestley, Jeremy Bentham, and William Blake, just to name a few. The argument for something like the inevitability of freedom and the impossibility of enforcing laws that would constrain it consists in understanding the limits of public and civil law that revolves around one simple observation. And this is Spinoza again, for in reality it is far from possible to make everyone speak according to a script. Insofar as philology unseats a script and the claim that it can be enlisted to shame those who do not conform to it, philology is on the side of freedom. But the claim for the liberatory function of a philology that revises our sense of the integrity and reliability of a text also involves a claim against those committed to the text in its pre-philologically approved version. Derrida may have had a point in mocking Lévi-Strauss's observation in Tristes Tropiques that he had observed the advent of writing among the Nambikwara and had been able to see for himself that writing was, then and always, in the service of the exercise of power. Lévi-Strauss, making a philological point, claims that he can identify the lines that the Nambikwara chief makes and exchanges with him as the imitation of writing rather than the thing itself. Lévi-Strauss's writing is the real thing, the chief's only the show. And Lévi-Strauss is eager to extend the point he derives from that distinction to a condemnation of writing in general and the purposes it serves in, he would say, all societies. We may encourage people to go to school by saying that knowledge is power and encouraging them to think that they will gain power and independence by virtue of their literacy. Lévi-Strauss, however, takes an entirely different tack. He claims that universal literacy primarily serves the interests of the rulers of a society. He insists that modern persons are required to become literate so that ignorance of the law will be no excuse. Writing is violent in this account precisely because it's an instrument of the powerful, and control of texts becomes a particularly important weapon in that struggle. Though Lévi-Strauss doesn't explicitly mention philology, it seems clear that he would see philology much as Pollock sees it, as an exercise that aims to free persons from illegitimate exercises of power made in the name of written texts. While it certainly privileges writing over speech, it can plausibly claim to test writing from within, to demand an internal consistency that the sacralized and politicized versions of writing can't supply. This is to say that if we think of writing as Lévi-Strauss does and deem it a hostile medium, Philology aims to meet its hostility with hostility, for it attacks texts that may matter to persons who would never identify themselves or even imagine themselves to be priests and rulers. Anyone who's been accustomed to think in the company of a particular text that she is esteemed and regarded in a particular light might be expected to experience a shock at seeing the integrity of that text challenged. The changes wrought in a familiar text might feel at least as much like a privation as Wordsworth thought his poems and lyrical ballads must be to persons who had a pardonable fondness for the poetry that had pleased them before. Even as religious persons who did not accept the philological vivisection of the Pentateuch and the Gospels came to be seen as literalists, the case of aesthetic judgment, as Wordsworth puts it, makes their views easier to comprehend. Those who were attached to a pre-philologized Bible, those who were attached to a pre-philologized Homer, who had the decency to be a single person rather than a legion, could well have been something other than members of a sinister priestly class, could well have seen themselves as exercising that pardonable fondness for what had pleased them before. And indeed, it seems worth saying that Spinoza himself recognized that he was not simply on the side of righteousness in his claim for the enlightened thinking that he was doing. He recognized that that enlightened thinking was going to cause trouble. He saw someone who needed to profess his good intentions at every turn, because he saw that he was asking people to give up a sense of satisfaction and security that they had felt in thinking of a Pentateuch exclusively composed by Moses, or Homer exclusively composed by one person. My conjoining religious texts with literary texts and the attitudes of religious believers with aesthetic judgments may sound like a way of disparaging both, or telling a story that I think has been substantially misstated or overworked, that of the evolution of religion into literature. But I take it to be a striking fact about the philological discussions of the Bible and of classical texts, the texts of what passed for dominant religious belief and of attention to stories of God that were obsolete for Western Europeans, that analyses of the texts that were believed and of the texts that were not believed were continually exchanging their methods with one another. As Turner tells the story of the advance of philology, it's a story of the increasing reliance on material evidence, whether it appears in the form of documents, archaeological remains, or contemporary anthropological testimony about remote societies that were said to present the historical past in their own current practices. To Pollock's definition of philology as the discipline of making sense of text, we should add Turner's definition of it as the discipline that continually asks how seriously one ought to take historical documents. And to both of these, we should add the observation that the seriousness with which we take the documents might be translated into a statement about the proximity we as readers are entitled to feel in relation to them. For Turner, philology is an essentially historical discipline in which the difference between eras looms larger than the cultural continuities. He's thus amused by and genially dismissive of 19th century English gentlemen who, having become learned in languages that were no longer spoken, thought of themselves as part of the same culture as Homer. They seem themselves to have been variants of the theme of anachronistic survival that anthropology has sometimes sounded. Wolff's claim that the Homeric epics had been composed over centuries could have been seen as evidence that there was enough cultural continuity for poets and rhapsodes to feel that they could expand on the inherited materials, and for readers to feel that their grasp of the text was yet more evidence of cultural continuity. Such an argument retains its power for the philosopher Bernard Williams, when in Shame and Necessity he declares that we are the Greeks, that we continue to read Greek epics and tragedies because we are the direct cultural descendants of them. My point in drawing a distinction between Turner's account of philology as an historicizing methodology and Williams's account of Homeric text is to point to the ways in which specific kinds of observations are bound up in each approach. I'm putting words in Turner's mouth because he doesn't engage directly with specific examples of scholarly commentary, but it's easy to imagine that a classicist who epitomizes the view that the ancient Greeks are not us would seem to provide an example worth emulating in his view. The scholar I have in mind is Bruno Snell, with his claim that the ancient Greeks had no notion of individual autonomy and agency, that they saw all of human life to be governed by fate and simply administered by the gods. The ancient Greeks, this view goes, being totally unlike us, didn't have ways of conceiving of their actions that resemble our own. The point of historical work into the history of the evolution and transmission of the Homeric text is to give us a sense of maximal historical distance, a distance that would keep us from imagining that there is significant continuity between ancient and contemporary thought. Williams, by contrast, does what I would be inclined to call philological work along the lines of Spinoza. He analyzes specific formulations and wonders why the Homeric epic depict individual characters deliberating and debating with themselves and taking decisions to act in a particular way, if these characters really see themselves simply as the puppets of fate. Now, two very different accounts of philology emerge in this interpretative debate. Snell makes sense of the classical text partially by imagining that an appreciation for historical distance is an argument in favor of his interpretation. Williams by suggesting that the grammar of classical statements draws them closer to modern conceptions of action and agency than Snell supposes. Imagining the characters' actions and speeches to be intelligible involves not overemphasizing the remoteness of their beliefs from those of modern readers. Williams does not represent himself as a philological scholar here, but rather as a philosopher with a particularly keen interest in literary texts. But his handling of classical epic and tragedy helps us to see certain tensions in philology that Turner's interest in a history of historical documentation tends to obscure. For the philological point that we might attribute to Williams is that the history of linguistic usage makes it impossible to imagine that the ancient Greeks conceived of human agency in a way that departed in wholesale fashion from modern ones. Williams frequently makes use of literary examples rather than the thought experiments that fill the pages of many philosophical discussions, and usually offers a minimal justification of his practice. Literary examples seem to him to provide a more complex supply of examples than most philosophical ones turn out to be. From Turner's standpoint, Williams' appreciation for literary examples in the discussion of philosophical issues may look merely like further evidence of his claim that philosophy is a discipline quite different from the others usually classified as humanistic. For Turner, the historical genealogy of the modern humanities presents a strong case for seeing philosophy as distinctly apart from the modern disciplines in which he traces a philological pedigree. And he does this essentially by saying that anytime you're approaching a lack of reliance on documentation, you're setting yourself apart from the way in which the humanities have become essentially nothing but text and textualism. For most of this long evolutionary history, this is Turner, philosophers understood their studies as the opposite of philology, rhetoric, and antiquarianism. Philosophy was logical, deductive, precise in conclusions, dismissive of change over time. Philology was interpretive, empirical, treating in probabilities, drenched in history. In line with this argument, Turner divides the so-called humanistic disciplines into a reliably historical group that includes archaeology, art history, classics, social and cultural anthropology, history, literature, linguistics, and religious studies on the one hand, and on the other, philosophy. The disciplines in the large group have a collective integrity. Indeed, he goes so far as to claim that philosophy's classification as one of the humanities in modern American higher education resulted only from administrative convenience and accident of timing. However little philosophy departments may be interested in the history of philosophy as such, I'm not certain that they would accept Turner's account here. His distinction may instruct us on the range of empirical claims that he's interested in. identifying that large group of disciplines in terms of their appeal to empirical documentary evidence and separating it from philosophy, a discipline that's likelier to appeal to a past philosophical argument or a freshly developed example, makes it possible for him to describe roughly linear histories for various languages and cultures, even as he stresses the importance of comparison and comparativism to philology. Especially when his story increasingly is an institutional story, the account of who taught what at this or that particular university. His, quote, sustained argument about change over time cast in the form of empirical description, close quote, looks particularly at empirical descriptions, documents, essays, course lectures, and curricula that are treated as mutual causes of one another. It is, to put things another way, to focus on documents insofar as they are said to be law-giving, offering methods as scripts to be followed. That attention to method has the distinct virtue of separating individuals' deployment of philological method from their personal beliefs, and Turner can therefore see that participating in the higher criticism of the Bible didn't inevitably lead to religious skepticism. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. A philology that puts classical texts, the Hebrew Bible, and the Christian Gospels under the pressure of the need for confirmation from historical documentation, thus redistributes religious observance, what we might call aesthetic experience, avant la lettre, and the study of folklore. This philological pressure makes religion less reliant on scripture and makes folklore the province of God whom living scholars have never believed in. But it also exerts a strange new pressure in a different direction on other literary texts. Thus, in the latter part of the 18th century, Thomas Chatterton is not seen simply as continuing the work of an imaginary monk of the 15th century. He is instead a forger. And James McPherson is called out for having written rather than discovered and translated the epic narrative of a supposed 3rd century bard in his Ossian poems. The writings themselves may never have pretended to be anything other than fictitious and mythological accounts, but a philological pressure is already at work. It doesn't merely divide histories from fictions. It also demands that the fictions represent within themselves a consciousness of their own proximity or distance from the historical events they recount and the state of the language at the moment they were supposedly written. The main line of Turner's argument presents philology as history's version of double-entry bookkeeping. A text doesn't have autonomous standing. It needs to be come at in two ways, from within and from without. But a quite different account of philology, Michel Foucault's From the Order of Things, Les mots et les choses, represents the advent of philology as one aspect of a much more substantial change. For him, the ways of conceiving economics, language, and anatomy all shift at some point around 1800. In economic thinking, the change takes place in the moment in which one moves from thinking of economic behavior simply in terms of exchange, this for that, and begins to think as Foucault particularly identifies Ricardo as doing. Smith, Foucault observes, treats labor as a unit of measure because it can be analyzed into a system of representational exchange. For Ricardo, however, the quantity of labor makes it possible to determine the value of a thing in a system in which value has ceased to be a sign, it has become a product. And a product that doesn't hold the value of a thing produced by a great quantity of labor in a constant relation to the value of the wages for which the labor is exchanged. Foucault's point in drawing together economics, biology, and philology is, of course, to draw attention to the commonality of modern science and what we would term a social science, economics, and a humanistic science, philology, which Pollock dubs a soft science in a hard world. And the differences between Turner's historically derived map of the disciplines and Foucault's archaeology of the human sciences are more than incidental. For Foucault's analysis finds in his three paradigmatic areas of inquiry a rationalism that tracks the empirical from its previously customary location in the phenomenal realm of representation to laws that speak in no known human language. Poor, more labor-intensive and less productive land creates an undertow for the representation of exchange that continually aims to set up equivalences between labor and wage. The functioning of one bodily organ affects the functioning of another and may, so to speak, pull it away from a sense of itself. And in philology, Foucault sees perhaps the most dramatic instance of a change in knowledge production. For the history of philology that Foucault identifies is one that reports the supplanting of philology as the relations that the grammarian had established between language and its external history. In Grimm's and Bopp's work, it becomes possible to compare languages directly and laterally by studying neither their roots nor their representations, etymology, definitions, but their inflections and variable terminations. As Grimm and Bopp study languages as portions of a totality of phonetic elements, they discover various patterns which they term laws. These are unlike the laws that are the product of human legislation, of course. They don't involve deliberation and planning and conscious choice. They are rather formulations based on empirical observations in the manner of Newton's laws of motion. Sound stabilities and sound changes become describable, as Grimm said, because the preservation or modification of a given sound is never arbitrary. In focusing on language as a system of sound, Romantic philologists like Friedrich Schlegel, Grimm, Rask, and Bopp gave languages internal histories. No longer did they need to point to external events in sorting out the eras of a text. Rather, phonetic analysis demoted representation. Linguistic analysis of sounds rather than of representations showed language to be diachronic in its very nature. In creating an identifiable record of sound that operates according to its own laws and moves athwart the language of conscious meaning and representation, philology thus, as Foucault sees it, yields two complementary intellectual tendencies: the logical formalism that Bertrand Russell developed and the mining of the unconscious that Freud pursued. Both of these, in their quite different fashions, stem from a philology that is neither technical merely for the sake of technique, nor expressive of the individual preferences of its practitioners. What I'm suggesting with the benefit of Foucault's insight is that Romantic philology provides a form of criticism that shows up the limitations of exegesis in thinking about literary expressions. Philology, discovering a sound system that has its own regularities and operates in indifference to the meaning of the words that employ it, creates a new project for literature. Literature, no matter how much information it may convey, ceases to imagine that it can be efficiently didactic. It can now only be experimental. The sounds that philology tracks, then, provide an opening on big data early on. Looking at writing merely as a recording function, it creates a new point of observation for human linguistic usage. In the 20th century, this aspect of philology emerges with particular force in the example of Milman Parry's work on Homeric epic, and his claim that a number of repeated words in the Homeric epics had been included only for their sound. They are untranslatable, he said, because they bared no meaning. They were preserved in an oral tradition because they allowed the poetry to be remembered. They enabled it to hold its shape. Now, I don't mean to overstate the matter. We still use language to convey meanings and express our wills and our desires, but Romantic philology suggested how much more we do into the bargain. In thinking not merely of the collective authorship of particular text, but also of the collective practice of language use, it gave significance to an understanding of language that is human in that humans use it, but that calls for the scare quotes that Foucault puts around the word human to mark the perspective of the human sciences and their observation of human productions. Thank you.
Very rich and interesting talk. I have a couple of questions that they're very closely related to each other, or remarks. that might provoke answers, put it like that. Your Spinoza points, I think, probably are just the tip of an iceberg in a way. And
Yes.
one feature of the iceberg here is a particular idea that appears in the Tractatus, that the way to find out what an ancient word meant in its idiosyncrasy or distinctiveness is to look at the word usage. So the word usage is somehow the criterion for meaning. And that's a doctrine that then gets taken over by German Protestant hermeneuticians, Bechstein, Ernesti. You can actually follow Spinoza's very formulation of that doctrine in the Tractatus through these works. Ernesti's work is particularly important, the Institutio Interpretis Novi Testamenti from 1761, and where he talks about the usus loquendi as being the criterion of meaning. And then that doctrine gets taken over by Herder, gets taken over by Schleiermacher, Schlegel, Burke, all of this philological tradition. And it's not the only thing, by the way. I mean, the whole hermeneutic tradition comes out of Spinoza, ultimately. The complementing of focus on the word with focus on the author's psychology. That's a principle that also comes out of Spinoza's Tractatus. So that's an observation about the Spinoza part of it. That I suspect that sort of I could add grist to your mill there in this way, showing there's the other point though, it does connect up with it, is this point about so Bruno Snell versus Bernard Williams, and what I would say about that quarrel is, to put it a bit bluntly, Bruno Snell knew what he was talking about. Bernard Williams is one of your 19th century English dilettantes, and the crucial feature about this is that it's not accidental that Bernard Williams doesn't know what he's talking about here, because one of the things he, as a principle, denies is this equation of concept with word usage. And now there are ways of qualifying that equation that arose in that philological tradition that can be sort of justified. That's to say, there are sometimes, in advance of the crucial word usage, there are ways people talk that are obviously going to gel into the word usage that constitutes the concept in question. But Bernard Williams sees a much sort of more sharper breach. And so he just reads everything into Homer he wants, basically. Every time Homer starts talking about action or deliberation, he reads the will in. I mean, this is from a philological position such as Snell comes out of, completely irresponsible, and so that these two things connect up.
Is there another piece to this, or
no?
Okay.
Well, there are many other pieces.
Okay, good. Well, let me start with the Snell-Williams. I'm really an outsider to classical scholarship. So one of the things that I was struck by was just the extent to which someone who seems to me like a very interesting classical scholar, James Porter at UC Irvine, who's written Homer, the Very Idea. Is this a book you know?
I have no problems with Porter as well, especially his way of reading Nietzsche. Anybody who thinks the genealogy of Moses is a parody of historical methodology, has a problem to start with. It's like reading the Bible as a parody of itself. It's almost ironically or something.
Well, he has what I take to be a kind of interesting account of where current thinking is about Snell's view. And in his view, people at this moment don't take Snell to be a particularly convincing classical scholar in terms of having established the notion of all action being fated for the Greeks.
I think it depends. I mean, it depends on who you go to, right? I mean, in every discipline there are deep cleavages, and if you go to the issue of the will, for example, and you look at the best work on freedom of the will, the last 30 years or so, you look at Berniat's work, Michael Frader's work, they won't only confirm Snell's opinion that there was no notion of the will in Homer, they will tell you it didn't arrive till the Stoics, as late as that. So, you know, it depends who you go to, and for my money, and it partly turns on this very general principle of word usage being the criterion for concept possession. For my money, you know, this is the difference between serious scholarship and misguided scholarship, dilettantism, if you like.
Well, I think that this does get to a very important point, because I think that the thing that I find most important about Foucault's way of proceeding is that he's really arguing for a shift from an account of historical unfolding to an account of a broader attention to the kinds of things you're trying to collect. And it comes about, in his view, in a sense, by accident for philology. Philology knows that it's looking at documents, it knows it's trying to historicize them, but it ends up with observations about sound that end up being part of a different way of doing history. And so it might be wrong for someone like Porter to say that Nietzsche is doing a parody of history, but it's certainly the case that this is a way of qualifying one's notion of the adequacy of history as the exclusive way of representing the world. You're looking as though this is a very unsatisfying answer.
Well, but for interesting reasons. I mean, it's an interestingly unsatisfying.
Well, one of the things I was realizing last night is that Christian Moser's paper was one that is deeply related to the kind of story I'm telling about what happens with sound. And whereas he was doing it in relation to the reading of a text, it seems to me that the account that I'm trying to present of what philology uncovers, accepting the Foucauldian view, is to create a sense that literature is a place that is continually going to be interrupted by its own moments of something like accident and the eruption of sound that isn't necessarily meaningful. The thing that I think is great about Porter's discussion of Milman Parry is the way in which he's pointing to things in the Homeric text that make it sound as though by just saying da-da-da, da-da-da, you're keeping the text going, you're keeping the poem going, even if you don't have an actual meaning that you can assign to it. So it's word use of a different kind.
Yeah, so I mean, some of those issues are slightly different issues, in the Foucault and the music and so on issues. But just on Porter and Nietzsche for a moment, you said something in passing, if I remember rightly, about Nietzsche, which was about sort of Nietzsche cutting free from philological scrupulousness in his. Something like this was.
I'm not sure I even remember having said that.
In any case, it's less important whether you said it than I think there are two ways you might read the kind of failure to give scholarly footnotes and to quote a lot of ancient text and to discuss how to translate it and all this stuff in Nietzsche whenever he deals with historical subjects. You could read it as I think Porter is inclined to do, as he doesn't really know about or care about these historical facts. He's doing something like, in this extreme interpretation, parody of philology or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? Or you could read him more the way Silk and Stern do in their book on the birth of tragedy, as somebody who was, as a trained classical
Yes.
philologist of amazing skills,
Yes.
who became a philosopher, which he was. He's somebody who does do the philology, or has done the
Yes.
philology, knows about this stuff, but chooses not to lard his text with footnotes and with all of this stuff. He gives a sort of literarily molded impression of what he has learned. Those are two very different ways of thinking about what Nietzsche's doing.
Oh,
And
yes.
I think that way of thinking of what he's doing can equally be applied to the birth of to the genealogy of morals.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the issues that this interpretive dispute would come up.
Yes, I think I absolutely want to agree with you on that. When Nietzsche writes, we philologists, I think he means we. And he's, throughout that text, such as we have it, he's continually pointing to what are essentially scholarly differences of interpretation.
Playing about theologians, bad philology of the Bible, and so on. Yeah, I think it's meant in some sense serious.
Yes. I'm willing to back off the account of Snell that I'm simply taking over from Porter, but I do want to cling to the discussion of Milman Parry. That is something that I think Porter himself identifies, though he's not seeing it as a particularly important symptom of philology. That notion of the advent of words that are absolutely essential to the delivery of the poem without your being able to translate them seems to me an important insight about that particular body of work.
Also, a debate about that. But
Yeah.
how important that.
Howard Perry.
Yeah, just building on what Michael's been saying. I mean, I think Michael and I are going to agree about Williams here. I think he imports all sorts of what he takes to be principles of charity into the. Yeah, I think for reasons that Davidson talks about that I think are also incorrect. He imports principles of charity into the interpretive enterprise on specious grounds. So I come out on the Schnell side of sort of the formal issue, never mind about what he says as far as the content of what he's talking about. The Perry Lord stuff, again, that's pretty contestable. You know, there's a huge, yeah, I mean, it became a massive thing at a particular time, and now under historical scrutiny, it kind of breaks down a little bit. Depends on what you think about Slavic song practice as well. So I think, but that's not my question. So there's all kinds of things in your paper. It's so rich. The other thing I wanted to talk about was this this practice of Nietzsche's of not showing the wash, so to speak, right? Does it make sense to think that that's a way that he's drawing himself nearer to the text in a way, or at least giving an impression of proximity in that sense, right? Because the notion of, let's say you show your underwear, right? So you have all your footnotes, and classicist footnotes are quite different than all of our footnotes, right? I mean,
Except for lawyers.
And it's not just that they're longer, it's that they really hinge on, I mean, I don't know if there are any classicists in the room, but if you read enough of it, it really is a matter of following other people's footnotes at a certain point. It's extraordinarily complicated in that sort of way. Him dropping that out of the practice, even though philology, with footnotes, is a way, in a sense, of drawing us closer to the text. Maybe, as Schnell said, to see that actually it's quite more alien than we thought it was. I think Nietzsche is really sort of doubling down on that effect by dropping the apparatus, so to speak. And, you know, there's a sense I get in Birth of Tragedy, especially. I don't know whether Michael or you would think this is true in Genealogy, where he's really almost playing with the idea of being a witness at something, and something having been revealed to him in a certain respect. And I think this has to do with sort of the way he presents that, you know, apart from just not wanting to be pedantic. So I wonder what you think about that particular aspect of Nietzsche.
I think that you've given an excellent account, and I really don't mean to make it sound as though I'm trying to make Nietzsche into a defender of something like pure rationalism or a repudiation of responsible scholarship, but Nietzsche doesn't figure particularly in my account of what's coming on in philology. It seems to me that one of the things that's most important about Foucault's analysis is that he's going for what you can think of as the driest of the dry as dust data collection. And what's interesting about that is that it's as if we have a text that we know we're dealing with in a certain way as we're reading them and understanding them and looking at how the words are used, looking at how they can be translated. That's a very important realm of knowledge. But at the same time, as Foucault tells the story, and as I think he's right to tell the story, there is this tradition that says, yes, and there's all this other information out there that we've been collecting without seeing any kind of patterns in it. We now see patterns and laws of the movement of sound over historical time. And the sense of a kind of impassable boundary between these two things seems to me a very important aspect of what happens to not so much the story of what we can possibly say about text, but the story of how we start thinking about literature very differently. All of the things that involve automatic writing, all of the things that involve playing a game of chance, look like ways not simply of being absolutely arbitrary, but rather of trying to mine this reservoir that seems to have been created as a byproduct of the statements that people know they're making at every moment.
So I mean, just to follow up.
I have one tiny thing I should say before I let you follow up.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to if I'm taking people's time.
It's when Michael yesterday talked about the complaint that Luther hadn't translated the sound of the biblical text, you just are hearing an important claim on behalf of what it is that you need to capture when you're capturing translation. And it seems to me that the impossibility of taking on a translation that focuses on meaning and a translation that coordinates that unbelievably well with sound is part of the stake of this account. But Deman seems to me like a kind of clear descendant of the kind of movement I'm describing.
Yeah, I mean, just what I was going to add, and then I'll give over, is just, would it be correct to characterize this Foucauldian position as sort of what opens up with the real science of phonetics as a kind of substrate, right?
Yes.
That, and texts are really just, so to speak, manifestations of the substrate that have a certain kind of plastic plasticity to them, because the substrate will always flow through them in various ways that can't be controlled in terms of sort of scientific
Well,
forms.
I think that that's a bit of an overstatement of my position, but it's certainly a plausible overstatement of my position. Yeah, I think it's his position, more or less. But what's crucially important is that this is an argument about how, without discovering anything new in the world, you can have new knowledge. And that's a kind of important move on his part. The set of textual objects out there doesn't need to be different. You're suddenly in a position to have a different angle on them.
Thank you. I'll try to be very brief. Thank you. This was great and very complex, so I'm not sure I've grasped it all. So I wanted to ask you about this impermeable barrier that you just mentioned and related to the human in quotation marks. Mm-hmm. I'm also interested in the idea that big data was invented quite a while ago, and the idea of experiments. But somehow I wonder about the impermeability of this barrier, because we don't have, I feel, the same relationship towards the change in sounds or the change in the meaning of words as we do in the change in the geological landscape, or let's say in change in the gene pool. There's an argument that, for example, phonetic change and genetic drift are mappable onto one another. Cavalli Sforza has a very interesting book on that. Mm-hmm. and that linguistics can learn a lot from genetics, for example. But there is a way in which we are attached to sounds in the way that we're not attached to genes. So, in other words, the material does not have the same object status as it does in a science of the Newtonian kind that you were describing. Mm-hmm. So the law may look like the same kind of thing, but its force, I feel, is quite different. And the Grimms, for example, were scientists on the one hand, but they were also incredibly political and ideological, while producing their dictionary in other ways. So the big data version of the humanities, I feel, can never fully replicate or cannot behave towards the material in the same way as you might churn through chemical substances, etc. So that's why that barrier always seems to me very fragile of what it is that interests us in the material that we're studying. Does that make sense?
Well, I guess that I agree with you insofar as I think that things like sound laws are different in kind from laws of nature, in that laws of nature don't have a history. They don't need a history. They don't change from one era to another. Whereas the laws of sound are laws of the stability and the change. And they therefore have a history that one can chart. So the discovery of diachronic movement within particular objects of study becomes important as a freestanding thing without appeal to documentary evidence, the testimony of witnesses, and so forth. And you're certainly right that we don't have anything like the direct ability to choose the particular sounds that we're going to use when we use words, though we can be conscious that we are using particular sounds when we're making words. So I don't mean to act as though it's a completely remote and mystical thing, that this whole aspect of the consciousness of the sounds of words and the sounds of letters. But it seems to me that if you were to apply this kind of approach to the discussion we heard yesterday from Christian Moser, you would see that all of the things that de Man has to say about the difference that one letter makes to everything is a kind of exaggerated version of the position I think Foucault lays out about Romantic philology, and that it's a way of imagining that there can be moments in which what criticism does is to identify the sudden eruption of a moment in which a letter in and of itself matters, or in the case of the Purloined Ribbon essay, the Excuses essay, suddenly there's a moment in which this is not a meaningful word that's being produced by Rousseau when he utters the name Marion. It's just noise. It seems to me that de Man couldn't possibly have come up with that reading of that passage of the Confessions if he weren't taking weren't pursuing this general line rather persistently. I'll let you all go. Oops.